Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. I'm speaking to you from West Orange, New Jersey, in the United States, and today's extraordinary guest is coming to us from Australia. And it is 7:30 a.m. where he is. So we have to give David a lot of credit for getting up to do this interview with me today. Dr. David Roland is a gifted writer, presenter, and psychologist. His first two books that are published internationally are his memoir titled How I Rescued My Brain and The Confident Performer. The award winning How I Rescued My Brain, a psychologist's remarkable recovery from stroke and trauma, describes how David set about implementing his own rehabilitation plan using neuroplasticity, psychology, and social connection. David's latest book, titled The Power of Suffering Growing Through Life Crises, poses the following profound question to which many in our grief and rebirth audience will surely relate. When our world is turned upside down, what does it do to us? How do we survive it? And how do we grow as a result? The book details David's personal investigation into the nature of human suffering by drawing together the inspiring real life stories of 11 incredible people who survived devastating crises and grew in transformative ways. David not only narrates these stories, but he also examines them through the lens of post traumatic growth. Having read The Power of Suffering, I'm eager to discuss with David how navigating suffering provides a route to discovering new growth from the lessons it brings. This is surely going to be a compassion filled, impactful interview. David, I want to warmly welcome you to Grief and Rebirth podcast. Let's begin our interview with this question. Please tell us about your devastating life crisis and how it turned what you call your internal compass away from your own needs to love.
Well, hello, Irene, and thanks for having me on this delightful show.
This is a
I,
pleasure.
I think we're two souls in unison here.
I do
Uh,
too.
I suppose I don't quite know where to start with that question, except the obvious one, which is I was a person who had everything. You know, I was a very successful professional running my own private practice. I had a lovely wife and three young daughters. We were living in our dream home in a very beautiful part of Australia on the East Coast. So there wasn't anything that I didn't want or need, really. And then, as so often happens, something comes from out of the blue, completely unforeseen, and turns your world upside down. And the first series of events, the first of a series of events was me starting to wake up in the mornings and not actually wanting to go to work. And this is the strangest thing because since I was 16, I wanted to be a psychologist and to understand human behavior and help people. And a long story short, I decided to go and see a more senior clinical psychologist in my area who I knew specialized in trauma. And I'd worked a lot with trauma. And I had this idea that maybe the trauma stories that I'd heard, and also some of the things I'd seen, and I'd worked a lot with children who'd been removed from their families,
Mm.
had come to disturb me because I was having nightmares about my own children and my own family, imagining us in terrible situations. And he said, I think, David, you've got post-traumatic stress disorder and you're also depressed. So he suggested I take some time off my practice. I was self-employed. So I thought, well, I'll take 6 months off and get back to it after then. Well, I was still going with psychotherapy with Wayne, and a year and a half later, I had a stroke out of the blue. I hadn't been able to return to work, but I was starting to get better. But this also coincided with the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009. So I have a lot of sympathy for people going through, financial upheavals at the moment. I know what it feels like. And we had lost our life savings by then because I hadn't been working. And this stroke that came out of the blue was probably due to extreme stress brought on by the financial crisis. I had no medical reasons to have a stroke. I was what they classify as a young stroke.
Mm.
And that left me with, some serious brain injury. But the most difficult aspect of that was it affected my auditory processing, so my ability to have conversations. I describe it as being like speaking English as a second language, where you hear somebody speak and you think, okay, what do those words mean? I've got to translate that into my language, and then I've got to think of an answer, and then I've got to repeat it back. And also, I had incredible amnesia. So, this conversation that we're having right now would have been impossible for me. I would have already forgotten the question that you'd asked me,
Wow.
and whether I told you what I'm telling you already, So, I had this incredible amnesia. But I had to, and I also had incredible mental fatigue, which is very common with brain injury. So, I would have a conversation like this, and then I would have to go go to bed for an hour or two. So I had to embark on my own rehabilitation because I was what they call a walk and talk stroke. I walked out of hospital. I was misdiagnosed in the beginning. They said, "Oh, you've got some type of psychologically induced amnesia." But fortunately, a psychiatrist in the hospital thought you should do some more neurological tests. So 3 weeks after the morning I woke up after having a stroke, I was actually properly diagnosed. But there was nothing to be done according to my physician. So I went home and I spent some time, just recovering, but then starting to think, what can I do? And that's when I started reading. I started talking to some people that I knew in the brain injury sphere and gradually put together my own rehabilitation program. I would say there was a period of about 5 or 6 years from that time I started waking up and not wanting to go to work, the stroke, the financial crisis
Wow.
where we were on our knees financially, and then
So
I
hard.
got better enough that I could start to think about my family and think beyond myself, and then my wife wanted a divorce. The marriage had been a little bit difficult. It had been difficult during this year, but she wanted out, and so that meant the separation of the family, and that caused incredible grief for
More
me.
trauma. More trauma.
More trauma. So I would say it was about a period of 5 or 6 weeks. Sorry, 5 or 6 years.
Right.
That all the what I call my difficult run.
Wow. David, can you tell us what is the difference between pain and suffering?
It's an interesting distinction. I didn't realize it until I'd experienced intense suffering and then, grew out of my suffering. So if we use grief, for example, when we lose a loved one, we experience grief, and we experience grief as a very normal, human, natural reaction because if we're not experiencing grief, it means we're not connected with anyone, we're not loving anyone. So that's pain, that's emotional pain. We get physical pain if we step on something sharp, and the sharp pain tells us we've stepped on something and we need to fix it. So pain has got this survival aspect to it where it's there to tell us something's wrong and we need to attend to it. So if it's emotional pain or physical pain, we respond to that pain and we do the right things to get well. Suffering is when we layer that pain with other aspects, which makes the pain worse or draws it out much longer. And we can create suffering even when there's no pain. So, for example, a perfectionist, somebody who's incredibly perfectionist, will do a great job, but they'll keep seeing little mistakes in it that no one else can see. And they're creating suffering for themselves. They've actually done a great job. Everyone's happy, but they're not happy. When we lose a loved one, for example, one of the stories in my book is about Jane who loses Georgia. Georgia's 18 when she experiences abdominal pain, and then about a year later, she's dead from
Mm.
ovarian cancer. Now, Jane experienced pain, emotional pain, and suffering. But I can say now that Jane has moved out of the suffering, because she was suffering because she wanted Georgia back. She didn't want to lose her. And so she would keep wanting to have Georgia back. She would keep imagining this life with Georgia still here, as any parent would do. But eventually she accepted that Georgia is gone. But now her relationship with Georgia is a different one. It's still a very alive relationship. She still talks to Georgia. She still hears Georgia's voice, but it's an evolving relationship. But it acknowledges that Georgia physically is no longer here. And so the suffering has eased for her because she accepts the reality as it is. But the pain, the grief of losing Georgia will still be
Will still be
there,
there.
and it'll probably be there for the rest of her life.
Well, that brings me to another question that I was going to ask you further down, but this is really so that's why acceptance is the first step to moving on after after suffering. And I understand that because if you can't accept what is going on in your life and you keep fighting it, like your example with the perfectionist who will not accept that it's okay to have a mistake or whatever, you're going to keep suffering,
Mm.
right? Have I got that
Yes,
right?
yes. And acceptance doesn't happen, I wake up one morning and suddenly I accept everything the way it is. It tends to have a long tail. So I have this expression, bashing your head against the wall. I remember after our financial crisis, I would sometimes have dreams about us going on lovely holidays and doing lovely things. And then I'd wake in the morning and think, oh no, we've got no money. And that would happen morning after morning. And that's the human psyche is so complex that part of it can believe something and another part can believe something else. So part of me was accepting, okay, we don't have any money, but another part was still imagining that we did. And that was quite a long tail before I fully accepted that we didn't have any money, we'd lost our life savings, and therefore, what did that mean? So when you can tell somebody's achieved acceptance, is that they start to behave in a way that's consistent with them recognizing that the situation has changed, that that's how it is now.
Yeah, I can understand that. So, how does suffering open a person up to become a new version? Is that what you're saying? They accept it and now they're opening up to become a new version of him or herself? And then there's the quality of resilience within a person that I'm sure is an ingredient that leads to what you call post traumatic growth.
I think I like to say there's good news and there's bad news. And the bad news is that there's suffering. It seems to be part of human existence, part of human life. But the good news is when we experience suffering, particularly intense type of suffering that we're talking about, it forces us to do something different that we've ever done before. It forces us to open up in ways that we wouldn't have opened up before. So we might reach out to people that we wouldn't have contemplated before. And I know you've told me some of your
Oh,
personal story,
yes,
Irene, and you certainly reached out to people you wouldn't have imagined reaching out to before.
absolutely.
And everybody I've come across who's been through some post-traumatic growth story, they've reached out to people that they wouldn't have reached out before. It could be individuals, it could be professionals, non-professionals, it could be self-help groups or a new area of interest. Like I've got a friend who was a very high-flying doctor of medicine in the university, taught medical students, had absolutely no interest in meditation or mindfulness, but now she had some things happen to her which completely opened her up to this idea of alternative healing, which and she's thoroughly embraced meditation and mindfulness and is so grateful for discovering that area. So we reach out to new people, we reach out to try new things, and ultimately it creates new insights for us. And those insights I like to call wisdom. And then that wisdom guides us in new ways. And that's the growth.
That's so true. Why, David, do some people say stuck in their suffering while others flourish? Excuse me.
I think there's a range of reasons why some people stay stuck in their suffering. And the first reason is what I've just said, is that people for all sorts of reasons, don't open up to other people. Particularly, I find we're talking about intense suffering here, not just everyday type of suffering. With intense suffering, we can't do it on our own. We can't get through it on our own. So we really do need to reach out to other people. And for whatever reason, these people don't do that, and tend to find that with people that are incredibly self-reliant. It requires some sense of vulnerability to reveal myself to others.
Right.
And I can think of some people who just will not reach out to others. They won't even join a self-help group. And I can't fully explain why that is. There's
I
certainly
know
some,
people like that too, David, and it really is
yes.
disturbing because I say it's right out there shining. It's right out there shining for you to grab it, and you won't do it. Do you think it
Yes.
has something to do with they don't want to change?
I think it can be a personality characteristic. So we are born with personality dispositions. Scientists will say it's roughly about 50% our personality style, whether we're an extrovert or an introvert, or we're a curious person or we're not a curious person. We're born with that, and then about 50% is developed over time as we grow and, with life events. So some personality characteristics just are this very self-reliant type of person. I think I've got to get through it myself, and I don't want to reveal my vulnerabilities to other. So, and another aspect of this is people who see the problems as being out there, outside them, rather than inside. Like maybe I need to change. People think the world needs to change. The world is messed up. It's not me. And that type of attitude is going to keep you stuck. There's a lovely example in my book with Rob Gordon, who's a disaster psychologist who goes to help people after natural disasters, and he gives an example of two people, both a man and a woman, both practicing Christians, and one. The guy has had actually the more serious gunshot wound, and I don't know
Well,
what the details of that was. Um, and he gets this wound and he survives, and he says, this is a message from God for me to do something meaningful for my life. I've survived. It's God's way of saying I need to do something meaningful. And he becomes transformed and goes off and does new things. Whereas the woman who's actually what you might think of as the more devout practicing Christian, who says, I go to church every Sunday, I do this and I do that to show my commitment.
right.
Why would God do that to me? Why would he inflict this harm on me? And she can't get around this idea that the harm that she's experienced is something malevolent on God's purpose. So she remains stuck because of this fixed belief. So we can develop fixed beliefs that keep us trapped in suffering as well. And the only final thing I'll say is that our childhood styles of attachment, so where we've had secure attachments with our parents or our primary caregivers, we're more likely to feel comfortable with reaching out with people and to be curious and to explore new things if we've had secure attachments growing up. When we've had difficult attachments, or what psychologists call insecure attachments, we're less, we find it more difficult to be trusting of others, and also to allow for compassion for ourselves. So there are two characteristics that can come out of our childhood which don't help us when we're going through intense suffering. But on the other hand, there are also things that we can work through as adults.
That's a question I wanted to also ask you that had to do with children. If the seeds of suffering are sown in a child's early environment, how do they who have suffered, how do they acquire post-traumatic growth?
It's an interesting question, and it can actually go both ways. So if you go to a place where children are not as well, where they're exposed to, potential trauma on a daily basis, like a refugee camp, where people are just barely surviving, and where, times are really tough. And, one of the stories in the new book is a refugee story. And that that early trauma can actually harden you up and actually make you more resilient for later on. And so when some major intense crisis comes later on, that child who's been able to cope with that difficult situation, as long as they've still felt some love and support, will actually do better when they come through another major life event, because they've all already developed some resilience. They know they can get through tough things. They just sort of roll with it a bit more.
But does
But
it but does it affect them? How does a child who hasn't received a love, who are living, you know, and I'm thinking of some examples in our real world today who are living without that love or that necessary attachment. Is there any hope for a child like that?
I think it's harder for a child like that. And that's where, as a community and as a society, we want to look out for our children's welfare from the very earliest days. Like I said, I was working a lot for the Children's Court Clinic, where I was asked to assess families and children and relatives where the children had been removed from the parents because of the parents' neglect or abuse, or they just weren't coping. Maybe they had a drug addiction, and the court was trying to decide what's the best for the children. Will the parents get well again, or do we need to look to, foster them out? And with children like that, having early role models where there is somebody who's supportive and stable in their life makes a huge difference. It doesn't have to be the parents, but they are starting behind the eight ball later
Yes.
in life if they don't have somebody who's stable and supportive in their life. And as I say, it doesn't have to be the parents.
Let me ask you, if a child has a very traumatized early years without that love, but then later on, someone does come into their lives, even when they're maybe 9 or 10 or going into their teen years, is there hope for that child? Can they be
Yes,
brought back in a way?
there's always hope. I always think there's hope, Irene, but it's just more difficult. As you say, they do need to find somebody. And, there's a few stories in my new book where somebody important comes along and it seems to be the right person at the right time. And, the person makes a connection with them and then things start to happen. But I always think there's hope.
Okay, that's good to know. David, does time truly heal? People always say that. You always hear time heals. What what can help a person get through this initial survival period, aside from acceptance after this event? And for people who are going through trauma, and there are many listening now who are, what are some of the positive ways a person can cope with suffering?
The cliche time heals is partly correct. So what happens in time is we start to reflect on our experiences and develop, insights and then new behaviors. So if we think about the stages of post-traumatic growth, the event or series of events happens. There's initially shock and disbelief, and we talked about acceptance, so that acceptance period can take a while, and we could be talking months for that to happen, or in some cases even years. And then after that we get a lot of intrusive rumination. So psychologists talk about different types of rumination, which is just types of thinking, memories. So intrusive rumination is that keep, like with Jane and Georgia, keep thinking about Georgia and the times they had together and wanting her back. And these intrusive rumination is automatic. It's like somebody else is putting those thoughts into us. We've got no control over it. But then what starts to happen is this self-reflection. So I'm reflecting on, my state of mind, my physical well-being, and the events that have happened, and the way my life is now, and I'm starting to make some sense of it. And often in this period, people need to keep telling their story. They need to tell other people who are interested their story. And in telling their story, gradually achieving acceptance, but they're also getting new perspectives on their story. They're making sense of it. And then in time, we start to have more deliberate rumination, which is, where we've achieved acceptance, or acceptance to a point where we say, okay, this seems to be how it is now. What does that mean? What am I going to do now? And the deliberate rumination is about making new plans, moving forward. The idea of one door closes, another door opens. So opening to new possibilities, and maybe starting to look back over what I've achieved so far and thinking, oh, I'm actually getting through this. I'm making some progress. Maybe, I am going to achieve something, joy and contentment again. So we start making plans, and this is deliberate rumination. And during all these periods of time, we need what I like to call an expert companion or expert companions, somebody that walks alongside us. And these could be new people that we found, when we've opened up to others,
Mm-hmm.
or it could be somebody existing in our life. What often happens is that the people we thought we could rely on turn out not to be the people we can rely on, because they can't handle
Yep.
our distress or our suffering. They don't know what to do with it. But we need to find other people that are comfortable with that, or that we resonate with. So if in this period of time we've also got an expert companion or companions, then that will make a huge difference. So it's not the physical amount of time that makes the difference, it's what happens in that period of time. And that period of time it takes to move from, the event or the series of events through to acceptance, through intrusive rumination, self-reflection, onto deliberate rumination, and then making new plans. That period of time, we can't predetermine how long that's going to be.
So
So
it
when
can be
we're,
quite a span of time for people. I mean, it's not like
yes,
everybody in 5 years is over it and da da da. It changes, right?
yes. So I had, my 5 or 6 years of my bad run, and I would say it took about another 5 years before I thought, I've worked this out now.
Yeah, yeah. This is great. It's wonderful, David. Thank you. Um, how is we're sort of touching on it. How is self-compassion an antidote to suffering? I mean, in a way, it's part of opening up to new ways of being. And what else would you say about that?
I'll just, I think this is really worth exploring. So I'll just talk about a bit about the makeup of the human brain. And when we think about the evolution of the human brain, we've got three emotional drive systems, and the obvious one is the threat system, the one that keeps us alive. So evolution has obviously been successful in the sense that we're still surviving, and the threat system is there to, monitor if there's anything in our environment that might harm us, and we automatically react to that. So if we see what we think might be a snake on the ground, we jump or we do whatever without even thinking about it. But then our higher order brain kicks in and says, oh no, it's just a stick. We can calm down. So that's the fight flight response, sometimes the freeze response. The other drive emotional system is the one that's about getting ahead, finding food, finding shelter, finding sex, achievement. Our society really encourages achievement. And we get rewarded internally for achievement. We get dopamine hits, which gives us a high. That's why people, are high-fiving after they've scored a goal or whatever it is that they're trying to achieve. It's a real, it's a real high. And so that system, those two systems tend to get over activated when we're going through a crisis. The threat system, and how do I get through this
Yeah, because
crisis?
you're it's a survival thing. You're frightened.
Yeah, yeah. And we're recording this at the time of the pandemic, and lots of people, those systems, the threat system and the drive system, are being activated. But the third system, which evolved later in mammals and is most highly developed in humans, is the affiliative soothing system. It evolved from the rest and digest system, where our body is actually not having to do anything. It's just resting and restoring. And in humans, that's evolved into the affiliative system where we make connections with others, we develop social connections. And this is the safety system. So this only works when we're feeling safe. It's about safeness, a feeling of safeness. And that's why, when a child is being soothed by their mother or their father after they've fallen over or something like that, the child is soothed. The parent will naturally soothe them without thinking about why they're doing it, and the child will feel soothed. And that's making the child feel safe. So, what's happened in humans, especially because we've got the most highly evolved brains, is that when we apply compassion to ourselves, it's very, very soothing. It really activates this soothing affiliative system. And we can think of self compassion very simply as being, what would I do for a loved one or somebody I care about or a good friend if they were in trouble? How would I soothe them? And self compassion is simply having that same attitude to oneself. And there's ways in which we can practice compassion, and we can actively create a feeling of compassion for ourselves. And, in my own experience, that was through doing loving kindness meditation when I was going through my difficulties. And what seems to be happening when we apply compassion to ourselves, and it's a very different brain network from empathy, for example, is that it's creating that sense of safeness. And that sense of safeness just does lovely things for us. It calms the physiological system, it calms that threat system. Those three drive systems I was talking about, you tend to get
Mhm.
one dominating at any time. Obviously, the threat system dominates more easily because it's
Mhm.
responding to an emergency. And then the drive system might be the next, but the soothing system tends to get left behind when we're in crisis. So that's why we need to actively do things that soothe. And I think going to a self-help group or being with others that have been through some experience like our own, or they can resonate to, on a similar level. And I found it really valuable to talk to some people who hadn't necessarily been through the same experience as me, like PTSD or
Mhm.
stroke, but they understood what suffering felt like because they'd been through some major life upheavals themselves and come out of it.
All right. Well, what you're saying is, as I say to people, which I say when you're going through trauma or you're coming out of a crisis, who are you putting on your wagon train to surround yourself with? What are you doing to be loving to
Mm,
yourself? Because when I was going through my own experiences with the car accident and all that I went through and the grief and all that, I had certain people who performed different functions for me. I didn't realize exactly what I was doing at the time, but there was the therapist, there was the spiritual healer, there was my friend who was there to listen to me vent and help me. And there were these different people, and they became my network. And like you said, my old network kind of fell away. And this became my new
mm.
survival team. And so it's very similar to what you're saying. I always say to people, who are you putting on your wagon train? Put yourself in the middle of that thing and, you know, feel safe. Who are you helping yourself feel safe? David, what is the hero's journey that leads to post traumatic growth when it comes to suffering?
Irene, when I was writing up the stories for the new book, I spent a year writing them up, and I'd actually, done all the interviews and transcripts, and I was aware of all the research and spoken to the experts. So I had a whole year where I could just sit with these stories, and I was writing one after the other, for one each chapter. And I knew already that there was something special about people when they go through these life upheavals, not only survive them, but come out as a changed person in ways that they really like. I thought there's got to be some name or some ascription for this. And I was vaguely aware of Joseph Campbell's mythology about the hero's journey and how it often featured in films and stories and so on. And I thought, there's something really heroic about the way people get through these life crises. And people would say to me, "Oh, you're so inspiring," or "You're so inspirational." And I couldn't get it at first because I thought, well, I was just putting one foot in front of the other. I was just trying to do what I thought was the best. I was just trying to survive. I wasn't trying to inspire anyone. And I thought, when I was writing this, I was feeling inspired by their stories, and I really got it. I thought, well, when we see somebody else go through some major life trauma and get through it and survive and grow, it is inspiring. So I studied Joseph Campbell's hero's journey and watched these interviews with him, and I thought, wow, the pattern that people go through is very similar to his hero's journey. So somebody is just going along in their normal everyday life, and then there's a call to adventure, and the call to adventure, or call to a quest in Joseph Campbell's mythology is, some event happens or a messenger comes. You can think of Gandalf coming up to, in the Lord of the Rings and saying, look, there's this bad thing happening, we need somebody to go and rescue the world. And so this event happens or a messenger comes, and then this person initially can't believe it. They don't want to leave the normal world. So there's a refusal of the call. But eventually they have to step over the threshold, which is the acceptance. We've talked about acceptance. So stepping over the threshold.
It's really a choice also.
It's a choice.
It's a choice.
It sure is. And we usually need somebody to help us step over the thresholds. This is where our first mentor or expert companion comes in. And then we enter this new world, or the changed world. And in that world, and I so relate to this because sometimes people withdraw. They withdraw from their normal activities or even their normal community. There's a period of what can feel like and can seem to others a period of withdrawal. And this is often where we're cultivating new relationships, like you've talked about, finding those new people to put on the wagon. And so we find allies. So allies are people that are trying to do something similar to ourselves. So we run alongside them. And then we go through various trials. So, there's a story in my book about Maurice Gleason, who was blinded at age 12 at a time when there were very few services for the vision impaired or blind. He's been permanently blind ever since, and he's now in his 60s. But he went to a school for the vision impaired, and he was told that he was dumb, that he shouldn't continue his education. And most people with vision impairment were told that not to expect very much in life. They would be basket weavers, piano tuners, or something like that. So he was put into a factory, but he thought, I'm not sure that I'm dumb. He wanted to test himself. So he went to night school just to learn English. And the teacher said, no, you've got some ability. So he then decided, and she said, maybe you could even do a pre-university course. And he was interested in welfare or social work. So he tested himself. So each of these stages was a test. And he eventually concluded that he wasn't dumb, but he had to go through tests.
But how brave of him! How brave of him not to choose that and not to accept other people's judgment of him. That's amazing. Exactly. So let me ask you this: what is the role of awareness to our personal narratives, and how does, and this question I know applies to both you and me, how does deepening spirituality, which takes a person beyond the self to the bigger picture, make an important difference in the face of raw pain and crisis?
That's a big question, Irene.
It's a big one. Well, you got a lot of knowledge and wisdom, David, so I figured you could handle it.
Thank you. Okay. I think there's two prongs to that. One is about the awareness and one is about the spiritual growth. And I think what happens when we've been through a major life crisis, which upends our world, what's happening is that we've developed a life story. And I like to talk about the story itself being the sense of self, like this idea of how the person I believe I am. And that's developed over time, from our childhood, from our society where we grow in, our religious influences, everything. So we develop this story, and the human brain has this ability to time travel, where we can go back into the past, we can drag up memories and say, I'm a person that likes to eat lasagna because of this thing that happened in the past.
His grandma
You
gave
know,
me
just
lasagna when I was 5 years old.
yeah, yeah. Now we don't think of other animals doing that, and then I can project that into the future, and I have a story already in my head about how my future life story is going to happen. So we have this awareness. Now, what happens is when the life event happens, is it disrupts that life story. So the life story and the story itself becomes no longer feasible like we thought it was. And so what it does, it creates awareness about this life story that we've created without even realizing it. And we have to create a new life story. And mindfulness, which I'm very big on because it helped me enormously, is a way of creating awareness of everything about us, whether it's our thoughts, it's our feelings, it's our physical sensations, and what we make of them. And mindfulness is simply being aware of what's happening right now with me. And that provides the data that we use to work on. I say it's like the internal weather. If you're a farmer and you're not taking a notice of the weather, you just plant your crops because you feel like planting crops on a Monday, you're going to have a lot of hit and misses, probably more misses. So a farmer understands that you've got to take note of the weather. And so we do the same with our internal weather through awareness of what's going on. And when we develop that awareness, that's when we can start to create a new life story. And then I think you asked about spiritual
Yeah.
growth.
Yep.
And for me, I can't explain why this is, except that I was drawn to Buddhism and Buddhist concepts. I think because I liked meditation, I discovered meditation, and there's some great brain science about why meditation is very healing and changes the brain in certain ways. And that's initially why I did it. But I started to understand that in Buddhism, there's this idea that we have very little control over our life. That the the um, the understandings we have about life are just one way of perceiving things. So my simple definition of spirituality is an understanding that goes beyond the everyday. It's just developing an understanding that's another level of understanding beyond the everyday. And I certainly developed that. I had some very insightful experiences on a meditation retreat and at other times where I could see that our typical way of looking at life isn't the only way of looking at it. It's not that our typical way of looking at it is wrong, it's just one level of perception. And for me, developing this extra spirituality gave me a lot of comfort. And it also gave me a moral compass because I decided that, leading a value-driven life was a means for contentment. And I looked at the Buddhist Eightfold Path, which talks about right speech, right action, not harming people. And I thought, well, there's a template for how to live a good life. So I would follow that template. So here was a way of thinking about life which went beyond the everyday.
Would you
It
say it would
gave
be
me a
like
template for living.
the higher picture? Would you say it enables people to see things from a higher perspective and maybe not be as deeply in the weeds from a personal standpoint? It's able to kind of lift you out of um, the swamps, so to speak. You're a little bit gliding more above it and seeing it from a different
Yes,
perspective. At least that's what happened
yes,
for me.
yeah,
Excuse me?
yes, it's like you've been given a spiritual drone.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
drone goes up and you can see things. It's not that the landscape has changed, but you can see it in a different perspective. And
Right.
astronauts talk about seeing the Earth from a distance, seeing this little blue dot, and they can never see the earth in the same way they did before they left the earth, because they now see how fragile, how we're all in it together, and human beings really aren't that different from one another. And my simple formula is, what I've noticed with people that experience post-traumatic growth and develop the spiritual aspect is there's less emphasis on the I. They reduce the sense of I, what I need all the time, just thinking about what I need. And they increase the sense of we. So we could be family, it could be your community,
Right.
it could be your spiritual group, or it could be, like for me, I think of one of my we's is other stroke survivors, or it could be your country. So it's a greater sense of we. And when we have that greater sense of we, it seems to correlate with well-being.
And another question as we start to wind this up, which is an amazing interview, is how does giving life meaning make a difference for those of us who are suffering? So you have so many people on the planet right now, David, and they are suffering. Would one of the things to help them be for them to look around their world and find out what they can do, maybe helping other people or doing other things that can. That's what happened to me actually after the accident and all that happened to me. I became a founding board member of an organization that helped children with grief, and that gave my life meaning. It gave me, and it also took my focus away from myself. So I'm wondering if that is a prescription for people who are suffering, to find something that gives their lives meaning.
Yes. And I think finding meaning, Irene, isn't something we work out today and then that's how it is forevermore. Finding meaning is an evolving process.
Absolutely.
So what is really meaningful for me today may evolve in some way. There's a lovely story in the book with Steve Garlick. Steve Garlick was the economist who had a car accident,
And he
and he
lost his
lost.
family, or his son was very badly hurt.
Yes,
I remember
he
that.
lost his wife and youngest son, and the second son, had a severe brain injury. And so initially, his purpose in life, what gave him meaning, was helping his son who survived with the head injury, to rehabilitate at a time when there was very little rehabilitation services for children like that. But interestingly, after he started to get his son on the road to recovery, he one thing that happened for him was in he was stuck in his suffering, other than helping his son, was that one of his work colleagues said, "Oh, look, I'm going to this group." It was actually put on by the Catholic Church. It was about new beginnings, and it's for people going through divorce or had a life-threatening illness, or something had disrupted their life story. And he thought, "Oh, that sounds like touchy-feely stuff." But anyway, his work colleague convinced him to go. And he went along and he started to hear everybody's stories. And he said, I thought I was the only one in the world suffering. But then I heard everybody else's stories. And he said, hearing their stories, I realized that I could offer them solace. I could help them in whatever ways I could help. And that relieved him of some of his suffering. So by helping others and resonating with their suffering, even when we're in a group like that, just being a listener to somebody else telling their story is helping them. That was the start of him releasing his suffering. And then another woman came into his life, and one thing led to another, and they started rescuing wildlife that had been hit on the road or been, we have a lot of kangaroos here, as you know, and they can jump into fences.
By the way, I have to tell you, I love that chapter about how you're describing that chapter about how those kangaroos were roaming around in that house and all the different things going on there.
So he and his wife rescue wild animals that have been injured, And he says, these animals give me much more than I give them. And he knew what it was like to suffer, and his family didn't rally around him as much as he would have liked after his accident. And he said, I want to do for these animals what didn't happen for me. So he's found tremendous meaning in his life. And honestly, he gets some huge joy out of the work that he does, even though it's physically and financially very demanding. And when we had our wildfire season here recently in our last summer, you may have heard, we
Mhm.
had the biggest fires we've ever had, and a lot of native animals were burned. And Steve and his wife Rosemary were at the forefront of rescuing a lot of those burned
Wow.
animals. Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. Put on your psychologist hat, David, and speak to us about the importance of healing in a person's life. And then what role the awareness of the bigger picture plays when it comes to healing one's life, because we have two levels, right?
Mhm.
I
I,
know
I
you can
think
speak to both.
I think we need to just recognize that life inherently involves suffering, and it involves mishaps, things that we don't foresee are going to happen. So, in other words, and we know this for sure with our physical well-being. Everybody who's been alive for only only a short time knows that we've got we get physical injuries, we get physical aches and pains, we get illnesses,
Mhm.
and we just take it as natural that we go and see the doctor, or we see a physical healer for that, or we take medicines for that. And it's the same with our mental well-being, is that life dishes out events that we didn't foresee. uh, even with time, over time, with aging, various things will happen. But so healing is just something that I think we want to see as a normal part of life, self-healing or seeking out other healers.
We'd like
And
to
now
see
I
that.
forgot, yeah, I've forgotten the rest of your question, Irene.
That's all right. But it's something we would like to see, that people see it as something that's a normal part of life. But the bigger picture, the spiritual picture or the bigger picture, um does that help with the knowing the importance of healing? I mean, I think of that as, in addition to having a passion for healing my issues, which has made my life so much better, but also because I've become very spiritual and I know there's a bigger picture. I am more conscious about how I treat myself. I'm more conscious about how I treat others. I'm more conscious about what I'm doing, because I know it will have ramifications. One day I will be on the other side. One day I
Mm,
will experience some of what I went through. What did I want to do with this world? So in this world with what I was given. Would you agree with
yes.
that? Do you have something to add to that?
Yes, yes, I love what you've just said. So I completely agree with that. And in my own case, it's been, what can I make of my suffering? How can I use my suffering that I've experienced as a means to helping others? That is a very clear one for me. And when I wrote my last book, How I Rescued My Brain, it became really meaningful for me to think, okay, I've been through this awful experience. It was certainly a terrible experience. I've come out of it, and I found out ways to come out of it that perhaps not everybody would know about, perhaps because of my professional training and experience at that time and my understanding about how the brain works. So why not write a book about that would help others? And it's certainly proved to be extremely helpful. I still get, great messages from people about that. So I know that book has got a life of its own. It's doing its own thing, and it's still resonating with people around the world. And this next book, I just thought the same thing. It's not so much about me, but I thought people need to hear other people's stories, that you can get through life difficulties, survive them, and even turn out to be a better person. We can't control what life dishes out to us, but we can control what we make of that. And that's a higher purpose for me. And I think this sense of interconnectedness, we're all interconnected.
Yes.
Um, even if we look at on a physics level, we're just electromagnetic fields. So we bump up against one another's electromagnetic fields. and that's all vibration.
Right.
So life is really vibration. At a physical level, it's vibration. And so we're all interconnected at that very subatomic level, and we're interconnected as a species, and we're interconnected with our world. You know, like if our world is not healthy, we can't be healthy. So the higher purpose really is what is the greater good for me and for everyone.
That's wonderful. Thank you. How do our listeners, they all want to read your book now, which I can't recommend highly enough, and they all want to read your other books, David. So let everyone know how to get a hold of you. How do they get a hold of your books? Spell it out. Let us all know.
If they want to contact me or at least find out more about me, the best one-stop call would be the website, which is David Roland, my name, and Roland is ROLAND .com.au, davidroland.com.au. How I Rescued My Brain and The Power of Suffering are all available as audio books and ebooks internationally. So you can get that through any of your favorite online bookstores. The Power of Suffering is recently published in the UK. I don't believe it's available as a paper book in the US directly, but you could get it through Amazon UK or the Book Depository, one of those.
Okay. And David Roland, with all you've been through, what is your tip on finding joy in life?
Dance.
Dance. Oh, I love that. Literally dance
One
and
of my
dance through life.
well, I literally dance. I do a lot of salsa and
Oh,
Latin
wonderful.
American dancing, and that came out of me wanting to heal my brain. I learned that dance was a way of improving brain health. But what I hadn't anticipated was that the social connection and the pure joy of moving my body to music, I hadn't anticipated that. And now I dance for the joy and the social connection.
Oh, that
And
is
if it
wonderful.
helps my brain, well, good.
Yeah, all the better. I think
And
that's
so
wonderful.
there's a short film on my website about my trip to Cuba last year when I went there to go dancing.
So, can we get on your website and all of us can see you dancing? Is there
You can,
actually, you can?
yes.
All right, everybody. So you can check that out. It sounds great. I would like to end this powerful, wonderful interview with a brilliant quote from David's book, The Power of Suffering. We open up to new possibilities, new people, and new insights when our personhood is assailed by suffering. There is a release before there is a gain. This is the positive work of suffering, to knock down the parapets of our assumptions about how life is. David, I could not agree more. As a person who has also experienced rebirth after trauma, I know that the darkest night can indeed lead to the most profound dawn. The insights to be found in the power of suffering can be life changing. I highly recommend it, and I thank you, David, for a very special interview. And here's a reminder, everyone, that you can see the show notes and all Grief and Rebirth podcast episodes on ireneweinberg.com. And make sure to follow us and like us. We know you do on social at Irene S. Weinberg on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. As I like to say, to be continued. Many blessings and bye for now.